Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport who are literally knocking down barriers to challenge the status quo for women and girls across society. I'm Sue Anstis, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through the National Lottery. And by way of lovely coincidence, my guest today is from Sport England. Ali Donnelly is the Executive Director of Digital, Marketing and Communications, having joined Sport England in 2019. She's a former senior civil servant who worked at Downing Street, where she was the Prime Minister's Deputy Official Spokesperson and the Head of News. Ali was previously Head of Communications at Premiership Rugby club Wasps and has also worked in media and public affairs roles at the BBC, having started her career as a journalist at the Evening Echo newspaper in Ireland. As you'll hear, Ali is a passionate women's rugby fan and a campaigner and runs the award-winning website Scrum Queens. She's also Director of Women's Rugby at her club Teddington and is a member of the RFU's Rugby Growth Committee. Ali, why rugby? Where did it all start for you?
Yeah, so when I was growing up in Cork in Ireland, rugby was frankly seen by me and my five brothers as a posh sport who, we didn't know anyone involved in it, deathly dull, loads of stoppages, very boring. And what happened was I moved house. So we moved from one village to the middle of nowhere, frankly. And the nearest town had a women's rugby team. Someone mentioned it to me. And although I'd primarily been playing kind of Gaelic games up to that point, I thought, well, why not give it a go? I was about 15. And I think a lot of people describe this when they find their sport, but I just knew as soon as I started playing immediately, this was my sport. And it was, I guess, a combination of the physical nature of the sport, which suited the style of sport I played. Less skill, more kind of contact and physical, the better for me. And then I also think what was great was I'd been playing sort of age band Gaelic games. So, under 14, under 15, under 16. And suddenly I was surrounded by women who had lived lives, mums, teachers, doctors, people who had 10 to 15 years experience in life and in sport. And I just absolutely loved that. And I think there was something that appealed to me too about the way in which women's rugby was kind of viewed and perceived. There was definitely a lot of stereotypical behaviour in and around the game and so on in terms of how people saw the game. And I saw that as a handy and interesting challenge to tackle.
And you mentioned the Gaelic games there. So what had you played in the past, just to give us a bit of a background to that, really?
Yeah, so I think outside of Ireland, it's not as well known as it should be, that Gaelic football, which is a kind of cross between what we would call soccer. I'm always loath to use that word in England, but what we would call soccer and handball. So you can carry the ball, you can pick it up and you can kick it. And then hurling, the female version of which is called camogie. It's the same ultimately, but it's with the stick. So I guess there's some similarities to hockey. And most young people in Ireland will play that with their village. It's a very tribal, patriotic kind of setup. And it's absolutely brilliant. The sports are very fast paced. It's a high skill level involved. And, most schools, if not every school, play it. And so I was playing that all the way through to my late teens. It tends to be a sport that people play, women, till their early 20s. And then they kind of move on. I think that's in part because we start so young, but the skills are hugely transferable. If you look at the Irish women's sevens team, a huge chunk of them in particular are from Gaelic football. And some of them actually go back into it later and play afterwards. So there's a lot of, around the catching, the kicking, there's just the general ball skills are very transferable. So yeah, I stopped doing that when I started playing rugby, though when I moved to London, found myself a Gaelic football team just to re-immerse myself and get to know some Irish people here. So I played at Fulham Irish for a few years. And that was great because you had Australians, English women, girls coming to play and having to teach them the rules from scratch was great fun. The Aussies tend to be very good at Gaelic football, actually. It's quite like Aussie rules. Yeah,
it's quite brutal, isn't it? I did watch some, in preparing for this, I watched some more videos and some past games, and it really is so physical, as you say. Has it ever gone across into the US? I'm thinking of people moving abroad and so on.
Yeah, it does. Australia and the US are the two kind of markets for where people will go. So we've seen in the last few years a number of very, very talented footballers primarily going to Australia to play Aussie rules or in the AFL there. So there's a real crossover there. So Cora Staunton, who would be one of our one of the most well-known women's footballers in Ireland ever. She went across and has made a real success of that. And that's a professional path for women now to look at. Yeah, there are leagues in the US, particularly around Chicago, where there's a huge Irish expat. I mean, the London leagues are also popular. They tend to be primarily for the Irish kind of expat community. So I guess there's not as much focus. What's interesting, I think, my wife and we'll talk about this often, when we go home and she's seen, for example, an All-Ireland final with women, there's 60, 70,000 people, blows her mind about the profile that the game has there for women and about, just the general interest and how little is known about that. And I personally think we've got these like amazing athletes, and imagine if we could get them all playing rugby, I think we'd be fairly, we'd be certainly in the top 4 nations in the world consistently.
And that is interesting, isn't it? That huge following around Gaelic sports that women's rugby hasn't had in Ireland. So why such a difference, do you think?
Yeah, look, Gaelic games are way out in front in terms of popularity and participation numbers, way ahead of rugby. I think football, as in the soccer version, is also ahead of rugby. So it's just got that tribal sort of, it's what you do if you play sport as a child. And also there's something really special about playing for where you live. So, I played for my local village, and I wrote in the book is just about to be published at the start around this idea that you grow up with, that suddenly you bump into reality as an adult, that everybody really cares about girls' sport. If you won, your county final as a 14-year-old, I remember getting in cars and being, driven in convoy up and down the village. People would be hanging out windows and medals would be held up, and everybody would come out and cheer and clap for you. And that's sort of how I thought it was. And then I suddenly started playing rugby, became an adult, and realized, of course, women's sports so unequal and unequal in so many ways. So there's something lovely, I think, about Gaelic games, that connection to where you live, the heritage that it brings, and that's why so many people play it over and above other sports.
But how wonderful, isn't it, that equality? That's almost quite sad, isn't it? Then you move on to other sports and realise that isn't there in the way that it was when you were growing up.
Yeah, I think for me, that was a real eye-opener. I think rugby brought that to me because it also had, I mentioned up the top, the battle was not about being treated equally. Actually, what I realised really quickly was the battle is about being taken seriously. And, I was really surprised about that. Not everything is the under-14 team winning the county final. Actually, people sort of laughed at women's rugby and thought it was a novelty. And that was a real shock to the system for me.
And how did your involvement in the game grow and transition from playing then? Yeah,
so I joined the IWRFU. At the time, they were the voluntary governing body for women's rugby in Ireland. So I went to university, wanted to become a journalist. I started writing about women's rugby because I was playing. And then a great man who has sadly since passed away called Mark Andrews asked me, I was very young, I was about 17, 18, would you come and sit on our board and do some writing and, turn up to the women's games and try and promote it? And I said, yeah, I was about to start university, why not? So I got involved then in the governance side of the game and moved to London in 2009, moved away from that. And I think for me at that point, what I was very frustrated about was that the Women's Rugby World Cup was coming to London in 2010. I'd moved to London. There was really very little coverage in the lead up. It obviously improved enormously as the competition came into focus. And I think I thought, well, I was now a journalist. I had some experience in the governance of the game. I knew people around the world involved in the game. Maybe I should stop complaining about lack of coverage and do something about it. So I then set up scrumqueens.com in 2009, primarily to promote the Women's Rugby World Cup, but it's still going, so haven't quite managed to end that. But it all sort of happened fairly naturally for me. I sort of think if you've got the skills, ability, and interest in changing the thing that you're moaning about, you should. And I guess that's what's kept me involved, I think, as an advocate.
And you worked in communications at Wasps.
Yeah, I moved to London, started out as a journalist, and then I moved into communications actually quite quickly for the BBC. And this opportunity came up to be the head of media at Wasps. It was the men's Premiership team. Did that for a few years. At that time, the women were very much part of the amateur setup, so we didn't have as much crossover with them at all. So that's different now, of course, and they're starting to align and merge more carefully. But yeah, I think that was my first foray into sports communications. And I guess over the last 10 years, what I've done in my career is flip between the two things I really am passionate about, sort of government and politics and sport. And all my jobs have tended to, flit between those two. I'm back in sport now, but who knows, in the future, may go back into government again.
And do you miss journalism?
I think that's the beauty of Scrum Queens, right? I get to write often, as much or as little as I want about women's rugby. And I guess because we've got a credibility as a an entity, an authoritative voice in the women's game, I get asked to write lots for other places. So I've written in the last year for the Times, the Guardian, hopefully the Telegraph to help promote the book, and back in Ireland for the Examiner, RT, and so on. So I get to have a bit of both, and that's fun. I definitely, want to keep my hand in there and do that, but I guess my life is changing and it's harder and harder. So if you can do it and pick it up and drop it as you please, that seems to work for me.
And just going back then to your career within politics, obviously there's lots going on in Downing Street right now. Whenever things kick off, I always think about that madness and how it affects the press teams behind the scenes. So obviously that's exactly where you were for many years. What's it like to be in the thick of it in months like we're experiencing?
Yeah, so I was at Downing Street for 3.5, 4 years, primarily during Theresa May's time. I was a civil servant, but in a senior civil service role where I was a spokesperson for her and would sit in front of the media most days speaking on her behalf, putting out the facts around what we were doing and talking about our priorities. I think probably the hardest job I'll ever do in some respects in communications. I think there aren't many jobs where you're asked to sit in front of the political pack every day and defend the government's record, promote its work, and be able to think on your feet in a way that, no other comms job, I think, sort of comes close to. I mean, my time there, it's obviously always high stress and the hours are brutal, and that makes it really hard for women, actually, particularly women who have families. The first summer I worked there, we had several national tragedies. We had Grenfell Tower fire, we had the terror attacks in Manchester and London, and all the while, over the period, we also had the uncertainty around her premiership because she'd had that difficult election, and Brexit was obviously happening in full force behind the scenes. So, yeah, it was incredibly difficult. To be honest, I loved it in lots of ways because I thrive on crisis, and I guess that's what I would consider myself a specialist in, crisis communications. And I think I'm a resilient person, which is, why I can juggle a lot of balls. But I, in the end, it really burns you out. There were times, I mean, often I would get up at sort of 4:30 and come home from work at 11 p.m. I mean, that's unsustainable, I think, in the long run. And then I became a mum through adoption. So I obviously was able to work right up to the point where we had a baby, but it became very difficult after that to sustain it. And it looked like Theresa May was on her way out and there was a new PM coming in. So I decided that was the time for me to move on. But yeah, I think when things like this happen recent months, I check in with my colleagues who are still there. The people who end up working there do tend to be pretty tough mentally because you have to be, and it's hard to last there otherwise. Your job and who you work with is on the front page of the newspaper every day. That's hard. But all that said, it was a privilege to do it. It was a privilege to travel the world with the Prime Minister, particularly a female Prime Minister. I learned a lot. And then I came to Sport England and thought, well, now I have to test myself in a world that isn't always mired in crisis. Then the pandemic happened. And so, all of those skills, I think, were pretty handy.
Yeah, are you bringing it with you? Did you bring that across then?
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder about that, actually. But things have settled down quite a bit, so hopefully not.
And what's that transition been like from government to Sport England?
Yeah, I think there was a big personal transition for me because I was moving on to an executive team and helping to run an organisation and not having, I guess, the luxury of being able to just look at everything through the lens of comms and marketing and then saying, this is the bit I care about and now I'm moving on. So you can't do that when you sit in an executive team. And so now it's more about thinking about the strategy of the organization and what are the decisions that we make as a team, which helps shape how everyone does their job. I think that's been a real personal shift for me. And, I've got a really great coach who's helped me to make that transition and, to stop being the person who has their finger in every single pie and actually take a step back. So that's been really interesting. I'm sure there are loads of people listening who've made that transition and found it hard initially. I think then from a work perspective, obviously the pandemic meant we had to really shift what we were doing and we had to get investment and funding out to the places that needed it to stay alive, frankly, in terms of their organizations and what they did to make sure they survived through the pandemic. And then the other was really interesting challenge for me was how do we keep people active and, how do we shift and support and motivate people and give them the confidence and tools to do that when everything's closed. And that's really difficult. And obviously activity levels took a real plunge. What I think's been pleasing is that we're starting to recover, and the last set of statistics we have about activity levels show us that things like team sports have bounced back really, really well. And I hope that we've been able to play a big part in that by helping those organizations who put those sports on to keep going. And to be ready to kind of spring back into action straight away. So yeah, it's been an interesting transition. Really enjoyable, but certainly not easy.
You mentioned you had a coach there. Is that something you have personally, or is that through the job that you do?
Yeah, through the job actually. I think I manage a big team, and I lead obviously through the role I'm in, and she's really helped me to, I guess, to sort of step out of the day to day. I think when you work places like Number 10, and I was the head of news of the Treasury before that, you're just constantly kind of firefighting, news cycles and media, and you're traveling a lot, and I guess what I needed some help with was thinking about strategic bigger picture, and how I can accept that I have to step out of being involved in absolutely everything my team is doing. That's actually not that helpful to them. So she's been great, just a really good person to be able to bounce off my fears, I guess, and my weaknesses, and to be able to attack those in a way that helps my team and helps the organization to be kind of the best it can be.
You've almost had, you mentioned, this sort of dual career, because alongside the biggest of communication roles, you've run Scrum Queens too. So you alluded a little to how that started, but I'm interested to know, at the beginning, I've heard you say that you didn't want to just be a fan with a typewriter. So what initiated it in the first place? What was that approach?
Yeah, I think as I said, I was complaining about something, and I realized I could actually do something about that. And, I feel confident in pushing back generally on people who moan about things who I can see are in a position to change that. I had the skills and ability in terms of writing and setting up a website. I had some time and I definitely had the motivation. So, that I think was it for me. And also I could see it making a difference, because at that time, hardly anyone was writing about women's rugby outside of the major events. So you'd sort of see everybody pull up 2 months before a World Cup, throw themselves into it, and then park up the vans and leave for 4 years. Now that doesn't happen anymore. And there were some exceptions. I always mention Stephen Jones of the Sunday Times, who has had a long standing kind of supporting role in covering women's rugby. And I suspect, I don't know this to be true, but I suspect he's had to do that in the face of probable opposition from, even his own editors and so on, because he was doing it as far back as 91. So I think it was that for me. And then as it's gone on, the Scrum Queens, there'll be people, I guess, listening who know nothing about Scrum Queens or women's rugby, but I think we have a unique voice in the game. We know the players well, and we've been on the journey. We've been campaigning and calling out inequality and celebrating success for a long time. And so I think when we speak, or when I speak, I do think, we do get a bit of benefit of the doubt that, these people kind of know what they're talking about. Sometimes a lot of what we do with Scrum Queens is not visible. So it's picking the phone up to people saying, look, this is a disgrace. I don't want to call you out because it's embarrassing, but you've made a massive error here. Can you sort it out? And people tend to be quite receptive to that. But sometimes you do have to do that, and I've done that to World Rugby in particular a lot in the last 10, 12 years, where I think something is wrong. For example, until fairly recently, there were no women in the Hall of Fame. And we wrote about that constantly. We wrote open letters, and we said, here are the women who should be in it, by the way. And then lo and behold, we had an announcement that women were in it, and most of the people we put on the list were on there. Now, I'm sure they would deny that there was a copy and paste there, because there was never any recognition of, we didn't even get a reply to the letter, frankly. But I don't care. I'm not in it to make money out of writing about women's rugby or campaigning on it. That's, I think, helpful in some ways for me. I really respect people like Fee Thomas who write about women's rugby full time, but that's not for me. I'm not good enough anyway. She's much, much better at that. There are loads of people doing this, by the way. I look at the Euros, and there are some really great websites, podcasts people who I suspect are not yet making loads of money, but might in the future, but are making a really big difference to the ecosystem. Women's rugby is not as far advanced as women's football, I think, on that front. There still aren't like 10 Scrum Queens, but there are lots of others. They're great podcasts. there are people like you who are involved in loads of women's sport, but have a real interest in women's rugby, doing your bit too. So yeah, it's been great to see that growth.
And it's interesting, isn't it? You talk about the coverage in the past. I was thinking back just to even 2015 when the Six Nations, like all the games were at the same time. I mean, it's mad to think of that now, isn't it? But it's so recent that they broadcast all the games at the same time.
I know. I think that, the momentum has built so much that people who run the game have had to think about women's rugby as its own standalone entity. And for example, the way the Six Nations has moved to its own window, I think on Scrum Queens, we've probably been asking for that or calling for that for about 6 or 7 years. We sort of saw ages ago that would be a good thing for the game, rather than be knocking up against men's game, the under-20s. And now it's here. How great's that? It's worked. So, the more the game starts to sort of stand on its own 2 feet and show that it's got promise as a sustainable kind of commercial entity with great interest from the public, the better. And I wouldn't underestimate in England what the Women's Euros will do for rugby too. We've got the Women's Rugby World Cup coming in 2025. The format will be different. There are longer gaps between games because of the rest period you need for rugby. The venues will be different and all the rest of it. But I think what they've done so well is shown the major events interest in women's sport. Like if you go to the games, I've been to a few games, it's not a football crowd to my mind, nor is it a women's football crowd in some ways. There are women's football fans there. It's a major events crowd, and that's different. And I think what they've shown is that you can kind of sustain that through a tournament, and that's what we've got to go after in 2025, I think.
And any thoughts on how they take that, because clearly we are experiencing that with Euros now, but into the regular week-to-week games of women's games, because that is the big challenge, especially for football, isn't it?
Yeah, really difficult. And I know that you can go to WSL games and there's still only a few thousand people there. I mean, I think it's about, there is some leveraging you can do off major events. Obviously, it's about making sure you've got all the structures in place to capture the data. So everyone who's come through the door is targeted really hard, geo-targeted. Like I live in South West London. I'd be disappointed if I didn't have some kind of contact from Chelsea, who are only up the road in Orbiton, Kingston. Those sorts of like smart techniques around knowing who your audience is, where there's potential for growth, etc. All those sorts of strategies they'll be looking at, right? The FA are smart, but it's hard. We've got a Premier 15s league in rugby, hundreds of people turning up to games currently. We've got to, I guess, make sure that as that league progresses, there's investment in the marketing capability of the clubs. The RFU are only be able to do so much. They don't live in the places the clubs are based. So it's about, I guess, making sure there's some investment in those clubs. I hope that doesn't get forgotten. The marketing, the kind of customer segmentation, audience data, the stuff that sounds boring, but it's really important. You can't get people through the door without it.
I was going to ask you about Prem 15s. Obviously, they've just released their new plans for the future last month, and clearly lots of investment going in to the new kind of format, new structure. But how much do you think it is about aligning it to the men's game, and how much does it need to stand alone on its own?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I feel like inevitably there's going to be mirroring. It's happening in women's football too. I think if you look at the Prem 15s as a standalone though, like if you want to bid to get into that league, it all obviously helps if you already have existing infrastructure, whether that's physical like a stadium or it's resource like the team around you to support that team. So naturally, some of the new teams who've emerged have had strong connections to the men's game, like Exeter Chiefs, for example. And I think we're going to see a bit more of this. So London Irish, Ealing Trailfinders, these are teams and clubs that we know want to get a much stronger foothold at the top of the game. So some of that's inevitable, and broadly, maybe that's acceptable. I think I would say the challenge is to make sure that the women's programs within those setups are not sort of viewed as watered down or mini versions of what the men's program is in that club. Because in reality, the women's game, needs in the long term its own identity, and it's only going to be able to do that if it's developed on its own merits, and the system and structure around it is based on a game for women. And you don't always get that if you are suddenly kind of a pop-up version of the structure that happens in the men's. And I'd worry a little bit about that, and in the speed to get things up and running and the speed to invest to get players. Exeter again is a good example of that, the speed to get players to come down there. I hope those sorts of things don't get overlooked, because actually, there is something so interesting if you take the time to look at leagues, women's leagues that are further ahead of us. So I'm like obsessed with the WNBA, for example, and what they have done in 25 years. We're obviously at the start of that journey, but they have managed, I think, to balance those two things. It's obviously it's sort of like a version of the NBA, but with their own franchises. And that league has got a really strong identity, and it stands for things. They are really front-footed about social justice issues, for example, and they do things much differently to the NBA. And actually, sometimes I think the NBA looks to them, and how they campaign and how they represent themselves. So I hope that doesn't get lost in this kind of rush to set teams up and to get bids in that meet the operating standards and so on. Because I think that'd be a massive shame. And actually, we'll probably spend the next 10 years unwinding it if we can't.
What made me think about that was your talk about that geomarketing, creating that fan base, because the fan base doesn't need to be the same as the fan base for the men's team too. And I think that's the danger, is we just go after the fans that are already fans of the men's team.
Yeah, and that requires investment, right? You've got to invest to find out. It's the same thing at Sport England when we do, large scale behavior change campaigns or smaller ones. We invest time and resources in finding out who are these people, where do they live, what motivates them, what will interest them. And I guess for women's rugby, it might be accepting that it's going to take quite a bit of time. There's a lot of games in a season. You have up to 20 games. That's hard to get people coming over the winter. The men's Premiership finds that difficult. So I suppose it's about thinking smartly about bundling up games and creating hype around formats and so on and so forth. But it's certainly going to be fascinating to watch.
Are you hopeful and excited for Prem 15s for the future?
Yeah, because I think the RFU have, grabbed the bull by the horns and have set out, a draft initial vision. There's more to come, I think, on that. It will not be easy, and there'll be loads of bumps in the road, and they'll probably come in for lots of criticism, and they'll get things wrong. Of course they will. But no one else is doing it. And I think what we saw in 2019 when the RFU said, let's turn our England Test 15s team professional, first country to do it, suddenly everyone's scrambling to catch up with them. And again, they're not all doing it in a way that I think is potentially right or sustainable. But England have, flicked over that domino piece. And I think they'll do that too with Prem 15s. And we need trailblazers. And there's no surprise that one of the most senior people at the RFU is an ex-player, Sue Day. She's not the only person there, Alex Teasdale and many other people involved in this. But I think her role can't be underestimated. And we might not touch on governance and leadership now, but, having people in these posts who understand the sport, who've been in it, whether as a player or administrator or coach or whatever, is really important. And I wouldn't underestimate the role that she's played there in getting this off the ground.
And you mentioned there, I guess, that juggling of Scrum Queens with other jobs, and you also have a young family. So any advice for people that might be looking to take on other challenges like that alongside jobs? How do you make that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be frank, it's like when people ask me, how do you find the time for this? I don't know the answer because I only know what I do. And I'm not an expert in this stuff. I think it's about, though, you'll never be able to give to something fully as a volunteer or as an advocate or on the side if you don't really, really care about it. I think what you find is the interest will drop away. So never do something that you think is just good for your CV, because you'll never look in the mirror and say, I'm really giving my all to this. And that feels rubbish. So I think it's about finding something that you really care about and thinking, what skills do I have to make a difference to this? Life's short, right? You want to be able to look back and say, I actually made a bit of a difference to the thing I really cared about. So I think that for me would be it.
Brilliant. I love that. Yeah. You always find the time. And as if you didn't have enough on your plate already, you've also written a book, Scrum Queens, The Story of Women's Rugby, which is released next week. Well, it'll be out by the time this podcast comes out. It'll be there and published. Yeah. And I was very lucky to read an early copy, and it is excellent. I learned so much when I did. So I just wonder, you've almost answered that, but why you decided to write it?
Yeah, well, firstly, there wasn't one. So nobody has published anything bar academic research, which is great, but not always accessible on the history of women's rugby. And I just kind of found that ridiculous. I kept sort of assuming someone else would do it. Interestingly, I know of 2 other women's rugby books being written right now, which is brilliant. So I like to think I maybe started a trend, or that I was a catalyst for more. So I think, there wasn't one. Again, I was like, well, I could do this, so maybe I should. So I did. It's been hard, I would say. Like, history books are really, I have such admiration for historians now. And also with this, the same thing is true for other women's sports. A lot of the history is lost, wasn't written down, is, spread all over the world in terms of genuine, people's attics, scrapbooks, club, histories, almanacs, and so on. newspaper archives. So the task of starting in the 1880s and getting to 2020 uh, was not easy. There's a whole bit in the middle that's sort of missing, the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, where I really couldn't find that much evidence of the game. And so hopefully somebody else will do that bit. But yeah, it was great. And, I got to speak to some amazing people and got to know, I mean, people ask me, what did you learn writing the book? And I'm like, well, a lot. Like, how do you distill that down? Like, it's a history book. I learned loads. But also, I think just my admiration for these women, there were men too, but particularly these women who in the 60s to 90s just got on with things. They just sort of did it all in fairly good grace. They really didn't have to. The setting up of the RFUW or the decision they took to run a test match, they just met up, said, right, let's have a test match. And then, Carol Isherwood tells this great story about how they were like, yeah, let's just do it. And then they spent the rest of the meeting designing the shirt. It's like that's kind of like, they're just these amazing can-do women whose stories are only really just being told. I mean, I think Carol's had a fair bit of profile because she's still involved in the game, but there are others who people just kind of forgot about, and they're just great women. They still are. I've got to speak to loads of them, and and the same in New Zealand. All these amazing women who were told you can't go to the '94 World Cup. Sorry, like some of the best players in the world at the time, and they just got on with it and never. They did complain probably, but I suspect we complain more now, probably because we can make more of a difference. But yeah, they're just great, and so it was a privilege to tell their story.
I love the idea of your telling the story and writing a book and then others following. When I decided to write mine, I spoke to Anna Kessel's agent, and I did say to him, I'm a bit concerned. I don't want to be seen to be writing a book about women's sport like Anna's. And he said, it's okay. We can have more than one book about women's sport. It's like, oh my God, that's so true. And it's the same for you. I love the fact that people are now, it's opened up for others to all feel they can do the same.
Oh, totally. And there's so many stories to be told. I mean, Alice Soper, who's this amazing advocate in New Zealand, she read it and said, well, I was going to start giving you thoughts on things you could, flesh out a bit, but there were like hundreds. So, maybe there's hundreds of books. I skim over whole decades because you just can't. It's a 120,000 word book, and there's there are whole years where I just sort of throw a line in. So there'll be more to come. Definitely, and I'm excited about that.
I was just going to comment on Alice Soper. I love the joys of social media, and I don't know her, but I feel I know her through Twitter and through social media. So fantastic how it connects women's sport in that way, isn't it? Too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And what hopes do you have for the book? What are your ambitions for it?
Well, I'm absolutely useless at PRing it, which is ironic because I work in communications and PR. Because I feel sort of slightly mortified that I'm PRing myself. I think if you are interested in women's rugby, clearly it tells the story of our sport and it fills in a lot of gaps for people around where we've come from. And, I really strongly believe that edict that, you can't really celebrate your present and know where you're going if you don't know your past. But also I think there's a lot of correlation with other women's sport. I've read loads of other women's sports history books, and cricket, hockey, football, all of us face similar challenges. And so there's loads of interesting crossover. And I think that's kind of interesting for people to read about. And there are some stories that haven't been told in there. There's a great story about my friend, Lynn Cantwell, who Ireland's most capped player. Absolute legend. I don't know if she's listened to this. Maybe I'll send it on to her so she knows I said that. But she played the 2014 World Cup, having broken a couple of bones in her back not so long before the tournament. Now she was past fit to play, and that's the tournament they, of course, beat New Zealand and blew the whole thing open and created history. And she didn't tell anyone. She told one teammate. And just stories like that, the sacrifices people make to represent their country and the things that they go through and the rehab and all the rest of it. So there's stories like that just about tournaments, which I think are interesting. And then I think also what's happened in the game. So where sevens has emerged from, how women played such an integral role. Sevens had 2 rejections into the Olympics before I think the then IRB thought, okay, well, we're going to have to get women. It was for men only, right? The first 2 bids, and women were kind of shut out from the sport. So there's all of that. So if you're interested in that, yeah, pick it up, order it online, borrow it off someone.
Buy it, don't borrow it, buy it. We'll put details in the show notes. I think the thing for me that I've found so fascinating was the similarities, you say, to other sports, that seeing that women's rugby has gone through exactly that same journey that other sports had done too. Like, disappointing and yet, yeah, quite enlightening too.
And in a way it had it worse, right? Because the game was so physical and considered so unwomen's like, I'm inverting commas here, and that prevailed right through the 90s, until fairly recently. So it's had extra stigma, I think, unfair stigma to battle through, and hopefully the players of the modern era don't have that.
And do you ever get frustrated when you see, we talked about the profile of the Euros on women's football, when you see the investment in that sport, or do you feel that's just all good for all women's sport? With your rugby hat on?
Yeah, I sort of accept. I think there are some sports further along the journey, and football is definitely one of them. We should be learning as much, hoovering up the knowledge that they've got, particularly in England. They're running a pro league. They've now just done a massive event that's been a huge success. So no, I don't feel that at all. I think women's rugby hasn't always had the best support and representation from rugby. Not that long ago, most women's rugby was being run by volunteers before it emerged. And, the IRFU didn't get involved in women's rugby properly till 2007. I mean, that's not that long ago. So I think that's where I get frustration, that we're playing catch up on a level that's hard to quantify. And that's not just because of the sport and where we're at. It's because often the people running it also kind of excluded and shunned us. And that frustrates me.
And talking of frustration, it's been a pretty tumultuous few years for women's rugby in Ireland. I wonder how long's the podcast, but maybe tell us a little bit about that. And I guess from a positive, do you feel they're in a better place now moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, the ultimate issue in Ireland was that women weren't being listened to and their voices weren't being heard, and the system wasn't set up for their voice to be heard. And there was a kind of prevailing sense, not by everyone, but by many people involved in running the game in Ireland, that they were essentially quite lucky to be there. And Ireland, for all its progress, it can be a bit behind in terms of attitudes towards women. And so I think what happened in the end was the players just got enormously frustrated with that. They obviously experienced failure. They didn't qualify for the World Cup. And although they held their hands up and said we weren't good enough, they also were saying, well, hang on a minute, we've been trying to say for years here that there are significant problems and no one has listened to us. And so they wrote that letter, published it, became a huge story in Ireland. They went over the heads of their union and wrote to the government and said, we have no trust and faith in our union. I mean, that was a fairly seismic moment, I think, for women's sports, and brave. I think they were really brave, the players who signed that. And there are some players who didn't. I get that. But those who did, I think. And then I think what happened in the end was we had a new chief exec of the IRFU, and it aligned well. I think he's genuine and means it, but also it was good timing, right? He could come in and be seen to be part of the new broom and fix that. But ultimately it's the same problem women's sport often has, which is things when these big moments emerge, negative moments, it's often because women have just been ignored, or they've been sort of like, and we talked earlier about mirroring men's programs. That was happening in Ireland too, and it just doesn't work. You've got to kind of be open to understanding, firstly, some biological differences, and in terms of structure and setup, and second, some human behavior differences, and then also things like your life. If you're a mum, we've seen some really interesting stuff around white shorts and periods, for example. I mean, the England women's rugby team often wear white shorts. I was laughing because when that story emerged, my club in Cork, we had red shorts because it was part of the kit, part of the colour. We were ahead of the time. We didn't know that, but it did make a difference, right? Like, I never had to worry about that. So yeah, the situation in Ireland is immensely frustrating, and sometimes success can be the worst thing that happens, because they were successful for a few years and everyone just thought, well, we don't need to do anything more there. They're fine. Things are changing, but let's see where we get to.
It was interesting because, as you say that, I remember watching one of the Six Nations games and I was like, come on, Ireland. I can't remember who they're playing. And my husband said, but do you really want them to do well? Because that doesn't give them not ammunition, but, and I thought, oh my God, that's so true. But I really did want them to win.
So I had such an interesting example. I went to the Ireland-England game at Leicester where they lost. I can't actually remember the scoreline, but it was something like 69-0, I think. And they held them to a couple of scores by halftime. And I was actually a VIP guest, and there were lots of people there from the IRFU. And someone on the RFU committee who, I've been very critical of the silence of that committee. I wrote a fairly damning piece on RTE, which was, I don't think that well received by the RFU committee, but, just telling the truth, I think, as I saw it. And one of them said to me at half time, I had written in the lead up that this could be, one Ireland's worst result. The previous worst result I think we had was 79-0 also against England. And this person took great delight in seeking me out at half time and saying, well, we're only 2 scores down. And of course the game ends, almost the record score, and they dodge me after. It's just this like slightly childish, way of dealing with things, instead of saying, actually, you're right. This isn't ideal. We're coming here. We're going to get hammered. It's not really fair on the players. Why is that? Instead of sort of this kind of game playing nonsense, and I just thought that was very indicative of some of the attitudes we see in the game there, which are, I think, changing, but not as quickly as I'd like.
And how much is having senior women in those leadership roles in those organisations important for those decisions, do you feel?
I think it's absolutely massive, not just for the obvious reasons, like they bring the perspective of women, but also because we've got loads of evidence to tell us that women on boards and women in governance positions, that diversity helps organizations make better and more profitable decisions. We know that, right? We've got evidence to say that. But I also think, like, one of the things I've learned at Sports England is around, we're doing a lot of work, say, with teenage girls and addressing drop-offs in activity. And what we've learned is that actually you've got to co-create solutions with teenage girls. You can't just sort of top down do things. And we've got some really good examples of that where things have worked in pilot ways and so on. And the same, I think, is true of running sport generally. You got to kind of co-create the sport with the people who either know it or have a perspective that is very relevant to the audience, in this case, women. You don't have to be an ex-player, don't have to be an ex-coach, but, being a woman is probably helpful. I'm quite proud at Sport England of the work we've done on the Sports Governance Code and in really working with governing bodies across England or in funded partners and making sure there's a strong representation of women on boards, also looking at disability and, culturally diverse communities too, but with women in particular. We've got the evidence that says it will make us all be better at our job. So why aren't we doing it? But yeah, and the Sude example earlier is a good one.
And you mentioned there the work that you're doing in terms of teenage girls and that drop off out of sport. Some of the stats recently were really shocking in terms of where we are with that. So I wonder what you feel needs to change. A lot of the work I do is in that space of elite role models to inspire the next generation, etc. But is that having the impact as we're seeing the increase in profile, but not necessarily participation?
Yeah, I think in terms of participation, yes, it has, but not as much as people believe, frankly. I think what our evidence tells us is that major events, elite events, that sort of side of the house, it tends in terms of participation to help people who are already active or who have been active, or maybe play one sport but might try another. It isn't. There's not always the strong link between, moving people out of inactivity. But obviously, it does have other impacts, and it is, in other ways, it is motivating and it gives visibility and so on and so forth. I mean, we've been discussing legacy a lot at Sport England recently. We've got the 2012 anniversary coming up, the Commonwealth Games, the Euros. These are all things we have or are investing in. I kind of personally think we've got to tell that story a little bit better. Visibility and role model is very important for sports that not always given a mainstream platform. You've got to really take your moment. So, disability sport, for example, in 2012, women's sport now. But I think the truth is, though, if you want to actually turn that into participation gains, that only really happens when, we describe this model of kind of confidence, opportunity, motivation. All those things have to come together. And that's what we're focused on. So a major event might give you the motivation or the opportunity to do something, but not the confidence. That's what This Girl Can was about, for example, helping women kind of overcome their own fears and so on and so forth. So there's that side of the house. I think the other bit is about teenage girls. So, really tricky picture to solve. I think we're starting to everybody does recognize that attitudes are shaped from a really young age. And we've got to be thinking about how we can improve and support better experiences for girls, whether that's in school or out of school. One thing I mentioned is about co-creation. So we've got this product called Studio U. It's a kind of Netflix style PE accompaniment for teenage girls. It's in 1 in 4 schools already. And we had this really terrible insight, which, you've mentioned some of it, but we also knew that I think it's 49% of girls told us that they were not confident to take part in PE compared to 72% of boys. And they told us why. They felt self-conscious, they felt shy, they lacked in confidence. So we spent a lot of time working with teenage girls. We sort of did proper deep dives into their lives, their experiences, the practicality on the teacher side of what it's like delivering sessions. And I think this process allowed us to come up with a product that really spoke to them. So one of its USPs is offering kind of different disciplines, which are not traditionally PE. So dance, Pilates, yoga, etc., delivered alongside, the more kind of competitive traditional stuff. So it's still in the early days, but the take-up's been high. Like I said, it's in 1 in 4 schools already, and we'll continue to push it out. And I think it's just about making sure we're not kind of top-down delivering things. I'm 39. I don't know what 15-year-olds, are interested in. Just to wrap this point up, it's not enough to imagine this sort of like link between big events, elite visibility, and participation. Other great magical things do happen. The country comes together. There's loads of focus and visibility. You can suddenly see a path for those who are playing. But if you're really talking about participation, particularly amongst teenage girls, a lot more work needs to happen in the middle for those two things to link up.
You've clearly been a real game changer in terms of impact you've had in women's sport, but what advice would you give to other people who are looking to drive change?
Like, without sounding a bit Nike-esque, I think it's that anything is possible. I think it can often be overwhelming to look at a problem or an issue and think, I don't have the capability to change this. You probably do. You might not on your own. You might as part of a networking group. You might as part of a campaign you might join, or whatever it is. And that's the way to look at it. I used to work with this woman at the Treasury, I won't name, and she made impossible things happen sometimes, partly through a style which I wouldn't endorse, but also she just believed that anything was possible. And it was like such a great reminder to me not to just see barriers all the time. And, I work for an arm's length body of government, and sometimes things can feel really hard. It's like, oh, we can't do that. Well, why can't we? Of course we can. We'll find a way to do it. And inevitably we do. And I think that's just true too. If you see, it might be you look at a match and say, there's no one there. Why is there no one there? Well, why aren't you going? You can actually make a difference in lots of ways. It can be small. It can be turning up at a match, tweeting your support, encouraging your children to play, whatever. It might be doing what I'm doing, setting up a website, writing a book. It doesn't matter. You can actually affect change through small steps. And, if you believe that it's possible to change something, it is.
Thanks so much to Ali for talking to me today. What an incredible woman, doing so much for women's sport and more broadly for the sports sector. If you'd like to hear more about other women driving change across sport, do visit fearlesswomen.co.uk, where there are details of all of my guests from this and the previous series. You can also listen to all the podcasts on the website, and you'll find out about the Women's Sport Collective, a network for all women working in sport. You can sign up for Changing the Game, our free weekly newsletter, which highlights the developments in women's sport. And there's more about my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Thanks again to Sport England for backing the Game Changers through the National Lottery, and to our production team at What Goes On Media, including executive producer Sam Walker and Rory Alskery. Finally, thank you to my brilliant colleague, Kate Hannon at Fearless Women. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook at Sue Anstis. And if you have a couple of minutes, it would be great if you could rate and review the podcast, as it does make a big difference to help us reach new audiences. The Game Changers. Fearless Women in Sport.